My husband's first love, Sienna, had a mental breakdown and ended up jumping off a building. In a blind rage, he hauled me, 8 months pregnant, to a deserted amusement park and strapped me to a drop tower ride. His henchmen stood around, their faces blank as they tied my wrists and ankles to the cold, unforgiving metal seat. If you hadn't pushed Sienna, would she have lost it and jumped? He barked, his voice dripping with venom. I was petrified of heights, and the restraints dug into my swollen belly, making it hard to breathe. Tears streamed down my face as I confessed my mistake, my voice breaking as I pleaded, "Hugh, please, let me go. I promised, I swore, I'd never cross paths with Sienna again." But my husband just stared at me with icy indifference. "Ava, for the sake of the baby, I won't divorce you," he said, his tone calm, almost soothing, but it only made his next words sting more. "But the pain you caused Sienna, I want you to feel it 100, no, 1,000 times over." Hugh ordered the ride to run nonstop for an hour, then turned and walked away without a second glance. The machinery groaned to life, the seat jerking beneath me as the tower climbed higher and higher. I struggled against the restraints, screaming until my throat was raw. Every time the ride plummeted, my stomach churned, the terror so intense I thought I might pass out. Then, on one brutal drop, a searing pain ripped through my body, sharp, hot, and unstoppable. A rush of fluid gushed between my legs, soaking my dress and the seat beneath me. The next day, Hugh finally remembered I was still up there. "Ava, Sienna's fine now," he said, his voice devoid of any concern. "As long as you apologize to her, I'll let you down." What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the platform had already been drenched in blood for hours. My baby had been torn from my body, somewhere between the sky and the earth, reduced to nothing but mangled flesh and silence. Dr. Jason called this morning. That woman skipping her prenatal checkups. What's her latest stunt to grab my attention? Hugh frowned, a flicker of disgust crossing his dark eyes. Beside him, Mason, the family butler, turned pale, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Sir, Madam is still up there, and she's terrified of heights. She won't even step onto the second floor balcony. Now that she's in her late pregnancy, could something have happened?" Hugh's expression froze for a split second before he frowned again, doubt flickering across his face. "Really? Ava's afraid of heights?" Before Mason could finish, Hugh waved a dismissive hand. "It's just a drop tower. It's not like she's actually jumping off a building. Let her be scared. It might teach her a lesson so she won't bully Sienna again." Mason lowered his head and didn't dare say another word. However, Hugh's assistant couldn't hold back any longer. "Sir," at first Madam was screaming, but later, she went completely silent. "And she's carrying your child, your own flesh and blood. Shouldn't you at least check on her?" Hugh's expression shifted slightly, but the brief flicker of realization was quickly replaced by scorn. "I knew it. Even her so-called fear of heights was just an act. If she were really that terrified, how could she suddenly go quiet? Ava's as manipulative as ever. Since she wants to put on a show, let her stay up there until morning. Tomorrow, I'll bring her to kneel before Sienna and apologize. Only then will this matter be considered settled." With that, he waved his hand impatiently, cutting off any further protests, and strode towards the bedroom. On his bed, Sienna lay half-naked beneath the soft sheets, her delicate shoulders exposed to the dim light. Hugh's gaze darkened as he approached, his Adam's apple bobbing with desire. Without a word, he leaned down and captured her lips in a deep kiss. Sienna whimpered softly, her fingers pressing weakly against his chest in resistance before she opened her eyes. "Hugh, we're in your room. If Ava finds out, she'll be upset." Her voice trembled just enough to sound pitiful, her wide eyes filled with guilt and hesitation. "And about what happened before, Hugh, I only did it because I love you too much. I thought that if I died, Ava wouldn't fight with you over me anymore. I never wanted you to punish her for my sake. Should I go and apologize to her?" She bit her lip, looking heartbreakingly conflicted. Sure enough, seeing her like this, Hugh's desire and anger intertwined. His large hands moved to roughly knead Sienna's soft chest, his breath growing heavier as he flipped her beneath him with ease. "Sienna, you're too kind. If it weren't for you, I would have died back then. Even your fear of heights came from saving me. Just thinking about how Ava told someone as gentle and kind as you to jump off a building makes my heart ache." His grip tightened possessively, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "If she ever does it again, even if she's carrying my child, I'll make her pay with her life." Hugh tenderly kissed the faint scratches marring Sienna's delicate skin, marks left from her fall. His gaze, usually cold and unreadable, softened with pain as if the mere sight of her injuries broke him. On our bed, the two of them indulged in passion, their bodies entwined beneath the sheets. Above them, the wedding portrait swayed slightly with emotion. My eyes were fixed on the photo, on the woman I used to be, the one who once gazed at Hugh with all the love in the world. In return, his face, even in that captured moment, was indifferent. That was when I realized even a soul could shed tears. At least Hugh could rest easy now. There was no chance of me ever coming between them again, because I was already dead. When Hugh first came for me, I was so terrified, I tried to run. My swollen, 8 months pregnant belly made it nearly impossible, but I still stumbled forward, desperate. He stood there watching, his arms folded, as I ran aimlessly like a cornered animal. In the end, it was useless. His bodyguards easily caught me and dragged me back. Losing patience, Hugh forced me onto the cold seat of the drop tower ride. His hands pinned me down until the thick straps and ropes bound my limbs in place. I screamed and pleaded, my voice cracking as the ride began to lift me higher and higher into the sky. I was still screaming when I felt a hot gush of liquid flow down my legs. My water had broken. I sobbed, gasping for breath, begging him, begging my husband, to save our child. For a moment, just one fleeting moment, I saw hesitation flicker in his eyes. But before hope could bloom, the soft voice beside him spoke up. Sienna leaned into his side, her face pale and pitiful. "I thought Ava's due date wasn't until next week, but she does look scared. She even wet herself before the ride went up. Maybe we should just let it go. I'm fine now anyway." That was all it took. In the next breath, Hugh's expression twisted with disgust. "Ava, you're vile. Using our child just to win my sympathy? Stay up there and think about what you've done." 100 yards above the ground, the wind howled, cutting through my thin dress like a blade. My teeth chattered uncontrollably, but the pain twisting in my abdomen was even worse. The baby was coming. I thrashed brushed against the ropes, the fibers cutting into my wrists until layers of skin peeled away. Blood dripped down my arms, but I didn't stop. My fingers clawed desperately at the knots until, somehow, they began to loosen. The third time the ride shot upward, I gathered every last ounce of strength I had left. And that's when I heard it, a fragile, kitten-like cry. My baby was born, right there in the sky. I was too weak to hold it, too broken to even see if it was a boy or a girl. Before I could reach out, the ride jolted violently. The tower had reached its peak again. The next second, it plunged. The tiny, fragile body was ripped from my arms. My baby, so small, so helpless, slammed into the unforgiving ground below. I reached for it, screaming until my throat gave out, but my shredded hands couldn't catch hold. All I could do was watch as that perfect little life was reduced to nothing but blood and flesh on the cold concrete. My own blood followed, painting the air crimson, a midsummer snowfall of death. In that final, agonized scream, my breath gave out. And where was Hugh? He was nowhere near me. Instead, he'd gathered the city's best doctors, not for me, not for our child, but for Sienna. All because he didn't want a shallow scratch on her arm to leave a scar. He brought her fresh roses, carefully selected from a florist who imported them from halfway across the world. He even secured a one-of-a-kind designer necklace, placing it gently in her hands to comfort her fragile nerves. When someone tried to report what had happened to me, Hugh cut them off without hesitation. Even if she's dead, she brought it upon herself, he said, without a trace of emotion. In 2 days, it'll be her due date. I'll bring Ava over to apologize to you, Hugh said, his fingers lazily stroking Sienna's hair as she curled up in his lap. Sienna traced light circles on his chest with her delicate fingers, her head resting softly against him. Maybe we should just forget it, she whispered, her voice soft and filled with guilt. I believe Ava didn't mean to do it. In the end, it's my fault. I shouldn't have come back. But I just wanted to be by your side. I never wanted to cause trouble between you two. Hugh caught her wandering hand, his voice unbearably tender. Sienna, you've saved my life. Just for that, I'll protect you until the day I die. He gently brushed her hair back, his gaze darkening with affection. Ava's my wife. She should have embraced you with me. But instead, she kept targeting you, forcing you to the edge. His jaw clenched slightly, a flicker of rage seeping through his soft words. I don't even want to imagine. If the firefighters hadn't saved you in time, I could have lost you forever. I would never have forgiven myself. Hearing Hugh's words, a flicker of unease crossed Sienna's delicate face. She shrank her neck slightly, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt as she fell silent. Bitterness welled up inside me, familiar and almost comforting by now. Half a year ago, Sienna had suddenly returned after living abroad for years. Hugh told me she was all alone, with nowhere to go. Without even discussing it with me, he brought her into our home, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. At first, I didn't mind. I even felt sorry for the fragile girl and took care of her in every way I could, preparing her meals, making sure she had warm clothes, trying to make her feel welcome. I wanted to be kind. I wanted to be a good wife. Until the night everything changed. Sienna picked up a glass of red wine, poured it over herself, then collapsed onto her knees in front of me, trembling and pleading for mercy. Her voice was so soft, so pitiful, that anyone passing by would have thought I had been tormenting her for days. From that moment on, the way Hugh looked at me shifted. That night, he didn't even give me a chance to explain. His fury exploded like a storm, and before I knew it, I was dragged to the attic and locked inside. He left me there, hungry and freezing, for 3 full days. When he finally came back, his voice was colder than I'd ever heard. Ava, you've really disappointed me, he said, his gaze filled with disgust. You have no idea what Sienna means to me. If you dare lay a hand on her again, even if you're my wife, I'll make you pay. After that, incidents like that kept happening. Small, carefully staged moments where Sienna was the victim and I was the cruel villain. Each one chipped away at Hugh's patience, until his eyes held nothing but icy contempt whenever he looked at me. I had planned to endure it, at least until the baby was born. Once our child arrived safely, I was going to ask for a divorce and leave quietly. But before I could, Sienna jumped off a building. The reason for her suicide attempt? Hateful messages and vicious voice recordings, supposedly from me. The words were brutal, cruel enough to drive anyone to the edge. But they weren't mine. Yet no matter how I pleaded, Hugh didn't believe me. All he could see was Sienna's pale, trembling form lying in a hospital bed, her tears falling one after another. His heart ached so much for her, his eyes turned red with rage. Even with our baby almost ready to be born, his only concern was avenging his beloved. Sir, madam, she seems. You should go see for yourself. Hugh's fingers froze around the pen in his hand. His brow furrowed, his expression a mix of irritation and indifference. She's still throwing a tantrum after all this time? The assistant hesitated, his hands nervously clasped together. After several seconds of hesitation, he finally said, No, sir, it's not that. It's just, madam seems to have stopped breathing. Hugh's large hands, the ones that had been tenderly holding Sienna just moments ago, stiffened. For a moment, there was silence, too long to be casual, too short to mean anything real. Then, a cold, careless laugh escaped his throat. She's really going that far to get out of apologizing? Pretending to be dead, just to avoid facing Sienna? His voice sharpened. Tell her, even if she's dying, she has to apologize. If she refuses, don't say I didn't warn her. The assistant's forehead glistened with sweat. He wanted to say something, but the fury on Hugh's face kept him silent. In the end, all he could do was quietly back away. In Hugh's arms, Sienna tilted her head, her innocent eyes wide with concern. Hugh, maybe you should let it go, she whispered. Even if Ava doesn't like me and makes things difficult, she's still your wife. As long as I can stay by your side, I can endure it. Hugh's arm tightened around her slender waist, pulling her closer. Sienna, you don't need to be afraid of that petty woman. Ava's not even worth your concern. His voice softened into something almost gentle. This time, I'll make sure she learns her lesson. Only then will she understand her place. But, no buts, just trust me. A teardrop landed on the back of my hand, cold and weightless, yet cutting deeper than any blade. That was when I realized I was already crying. So even souls can feel pain. Hugh said nothing more after that, but for the rest of the afternoon, his mind was elsewhere. His fingers drummed restlessly on the desk, and every few minutes, his eyes flicked toward the door. At the time an hour passed, he had glanced over more than 10 times. Finally, with a frustrated sigh, he slammed his laptop shut. Running a hand through his hair, he forced a gentle smile onto his face and stroked Sienna's hair. "I don't know what kind of trick Ava's trying to pull this time," he said softly, "but I'll go drag her back to apologize right now." At the entrance of the amusement park, Hugh's long strides carried him forward, his impatience radiating off him like heat. Even from a distance, his sharp gaze locked onto the drop tower ride. Its frame gleamed coldly in the sunlight, but the ground beneath it was soaked in red. The stench of blood hung heavy in the air, mixing with the faint scent of rust and damp earth. Hugh instinctively raised a hand to cover his nose, his expression twisted in discomfort. "What the hell is that smell? What's Ava up to this time?" His voice was impatient, as if all of this was nothing more than another one of my childish pranks. His assistant stood to the side, forehead beaded with sweat. His hands clenched nervously, but his voice remained low. "Sir, perhaps you should see for yourself." With a stiff motion, the assistant stepped aside, revealing the two shapes lying side by side on the blood-stained ground. Both were covered with white cloth, one larger, one heartbreakingly small. Hugh's large hands hovered uncertainly between the two. His fingers curled and uncurled, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face. His brows furrowed, confusion flickering in his usually cold eyes. I clutched my chest, though there was no heartbeat there anymore, only the hollow ache of something long gone. I knew what was about to happen, and the knowledge was suffocating. Still, I couldn't look away. After what felt like an eternity, Hugh finally reached out toward the smaller bundle. His fingers trembled slightly as he pinched the edge of the cloth, slowly lifting it. A sharp, high-pitched scream cut through the air before he could see anything. "Hugh, what are you doing? You're not actually going to touch that, are you? That's a stray cat's corpse." Sienna's shrill voice rang out as she stumbled toward him, her body trembling as she threw herself into his arms. Her face pressed into his chest, her small hands clutching at his shirt. Hugh's body stiffened under her touch, but her words seemed to flip a switch in his mind. His expression darkened, disgust flashing across his face. Without another thought, his leg shot out, kicking the small bundle aside. The tiny body rolled limply across the pavement, the once pure white cloth unraveling just slightly, exposing a flash of soft, fragile skin. "Get some dogs in here," Hugh barked, his voice cold and sharp. "Let them deal with it." The order was carried out instantly. Stray dogs, drawn in by the scent of blood and flesh, swarmed the area within seconds. Their teeth tore into the small corpse without hesitation, their low growls blending with the wet, sickening sounds of ripping flesh. I screamed, the sound tearing out of me like a wounded animal. I lunged forward, trying to claw at Hugh, trying to push the dogs away, trying to hold what was left of my baby, but my hands passed straight through everything. I couldn't touch anything. I couldn't stop any of it. But the pain, oh, the pain was real. It burned and twisted inside me, 1,000 times worse than the agony of childbirth. What had I done wrong? What had my child done wrong? The dogs didn't stop until there was nothing left but scraps of cloth and dark, but patches on the ground. As the last of the flesh disappeared, I caught a glimpse of Sienna, standing slightly apart from Hugh. A faint smile curled at the corners of her lips, a sinister gleam flashing in her eyes before she quickly lowered her gaze. "Enough with these games." Hugh's furious roar broke the silence. "Where's Ava? Where the hell is she hiding?" His fists clenched at his sides, veins bulging under his skin. "She drove Sienna to jump off a building, and now she's trying to scare her with some dead cat. How did I never see how vicious Ava really is?" He turned, voice dripping with contempt. "Ava, didn't you love that baby more than anything? If you don't crawl out right now, I swear, once the Real baby is born, I'll divorce you on the spot. And don't even dream about getting custody. You'll never see that child again." I collapsed onto the ground, trembling with rage and heartbreak, my silent laughter mixing with tears I could no longer wipe away. My parents were gone. Hugh, the man I had once trusted with my whole heart, had betrayed me without hesitation for Sienna. The only thing I had left was my baby, and now, my child, our child, had been torn apart by dogs, thrown away like trash, and the man who fathered that child had stood by and watched. Not even a body remained. I swore, from the depths of whatever was left of my soul, that Hugh would rot in hell for this. His voice rose again, loud and furious, demanding that I show myself, but there was no one left to answer him. Finally, the assistant, pale and trembling, forced himself to step forward. His hand shook as he reached down, slowly lifting the white cloth covering the larger form. His voice wavered. "Sir, Madam is right here. And your child, you just fed it to the stray dogs."